The impossible mathematics of war revealed themselves in the summer of 1943. Death arrived from above with mechanical precision that defied everything the textbooks taught about naval combat. Standing on the bridge of an American cruiser somewhere in the Solomon Islands, a senior gunnery officer watched his radar screen paint a familiar picture. Enemy bombers approached in standard formation, 12 aircraft flying at typical altitude. Nothing unusual about their approach pattern, but everything had changed about what happened next. 6 weeks earlier, this same officer would have ordered his crews to fire over 1,000 shells to bring down a single enemy plane. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. You aimed into empty sky. You calculated where the enemy might be. You hoped physics and luck would intersect. Most shells exploded uselessly in the void. A few came close enough to rattle enemy pilots. Direct hits were accidents disguised as skill. The numbers never lied about the reality of anti-aircraft warfare. Then mysterious crates arrived on his ship, unmarked containers with security protocols that discouraged questions. New ammunition with strict handling requirements. Nobody explained how these shells worked. Nobody discussed their capabilities. The results spoke louder than any briefing could. Now his gun crews destroyed one enemy aircraft for every 200 shells fired. Some engagements produced even better ratios. The improvement defied statistical probability. It challenged everything he understood about naval gunnery. The approaching Japanese formation drew closer. Standard range, standard altitude, standard tactical approach. He gave the order to commence firing. New ammunition only. The 5-inch guns spoke with familiar thunder. What followed was anything but familiar. The first salvo climbed toward the enemy formation. At precisely the right altitude, at exactly the correct distance from the bombers, the shells exploded. Not scattered randomly across the sky. Not bursting too high or too low. Perfect air bursts created lethal clouds of shrapnel exactly where enemy aircraft were flying. The lead bomber caught fire instantly. Flames streamed from its engine, cowling. The second aircraft began trailing thick black smoke. Its pilot tried to maintain formation, even as his plane died around him. The third bomber broke away desperately. Its pilot threw the aircraft into a steep diving turn, abandoning the attack run to save his crew. The next salvo anticipated this maneuver. More perfect air bursts materialized exactly where the evading aircraft had moved. More hits, more kills, more impossible accuracy. Within 3 minutes of engagement, half the enemy formation had been destroyed. 6 bombers tumbled toward the ocean in flames. The remaining aircraft scattered like startled birds, their attack completely disrupted. The gunnery officer lowered his binoculars with trembling hands. In 20 years of naval service, he had never witnessed anything comparable. Anti-aircraft fire was supposed to be defensive harassment, a way to disrupt enemy attacks and occasionally score lucky hits. This wasn't luck. This was systematic execution. That evening brought a classified briefing that answered some questions while raising many others. Gunnery officers from across the task force gathered in a secure compartment. Every ship equipped with the new ammunition reported similar results. Hit rates improved by factors of 5 or 6. Enemy aircraft destroyed at statistically impossible rates. The room buzzed with excitement and confusion. The task force commander stood before his officers. His words were carefully chosen. Limited information was authorized for release. The new shells contained miniature radio transmitters. These devices detected proximity to enemy aircraft and detonated automatically at optimal range. No timing calculations were required. No guesswork about altitude or distance. The shell itself determined the perfect moment to explode. Officers erupted in questions. How could radio equipment survive the tremendous forces of artillery launch? The acceleration alone would destroy any conventional vacuum tubes. Electronic components couldn't withstand such punishment. The commander acknowledged these technical challenges. American scientists had solved problems that seemed impossible. They had created vacuum tubes capable of surviving artillery launch. They had miniaturized radio equipment to fit inside shell casings. They had done all this while maintaining mass production capability. More questions followed. Could the enemy develop similar weapons? Intelligence assessments suggested the Japanese were years away from comparable technology, possibly a full decade behind. The manufacturing requirements alone exceeded their current industrial capacity. If this assessment proved accurate, America had developed a weapon system the enemy could neither counter nor replicate, a fundamental technological advantage that could shift the balance of the entire Pacific campaign. The commander continued his briefing. Hit rates would continue improving as crews gained experience with the new ammunition, but absolute secrecy was paramount. The enemy must never learn how these shells functioned. That explained their restriction to maritime operations only. If unexploded shells landed on enemy territory, they could be examined and potentially reverse-engineered. Recovery procedures existed for ships carrying this ammunition, but prevention remained the primary security measure. The gunnery officer left this briefing with more questions than answers. But one conclusion seemed inescapable. The war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The Japanese simply didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, over 1,000 miles away, confusion reigned at a major enemy naval air base. A Japanese pilot sat in a debriefing room, his flight suit still soaked with perspiration. He had just returned from his third mission against American naval forces. His squadron had deployed with 18 operational aircraft. 6 remained flyable. Combat losses were always expected, but the pattern of these losses troubled everyone involved. The intelligence officer prompted him to describe American anti-aircraft fire. The pilot struggled to find adequate words. Something had changed dramatically. Enemy shells now exploded at precisely the right altitude, not too high above the formation, not too low beneath the aircraft, exactly where the bombers were flying. The officer suggested improved American gunnery calculations. The pilot shook his head firmly. This wasn't about better mathematics. The shells seemed to follow aircraft movements. If the formation climbed, explosions appeared at higher altitudes. If they dived, the bursts followed them down. Skepticism filled the intelligence officer's expression. Combat stress could create perceptions that seemed real, but weren't accurate. High-altitude combat was disorienting. Adrenaline affected judgment. The pilot's voice sharpened with frustration. Every surviving crew member reported identical observations. The Americans possessed some new weapon that made their defensive fire impossibly accurate. Something beyond conventional anti-aircraft systems. The intelligence officer closed his notebook. Without physical evidence, only speculation was possible. The pilot knew his report would be dismissed like all the others. The high command couldn't accept that America had developed revolutionary technology. Japan possessed superior pilots, better tactics, and warrior spirit that Americans supposedly lacked. Technology was meant to be Japan's advantage, not their weakness. But pilots were dying with precision that conventional weapons couldn't achieve. Whatever the Americans had deployed, Japan possessed no counter for it. Over the following months, Japanese air operations deteriorated rapidly. Mission after mission encountered the new American defensive systems. Attack runs that previously cost 2 or 3 aircraft now claimed 8 or 10. Bombing raids that crews had survived multiple times became death sentences. The Americans had transformed the sky into a mechanized killing field. By October 1943, Japanese naval aviation had lost over 400 aircraft to American anti-aircraft fire in the Solomon Islands theater alone. Attrition rates had become catastrophic. Pilot training couldn't replace losses fast enough. Aircraft production couldn't match destruction rates. Most troubling of all, Japanese commanders couldn't explain why their losses had increased so dramatically. Some blamed improved American training. Others suggested better radar direction. A few mentioned rumors about new types of shells, but without evidence, such speculation was ignored. One of Japan's most experienced aviation commanders reviewed loss reports with growing alarm. The statistics told a story that conventional explanations couldn't account for. American defensive capabilities had multiplied by factors that seemed impossible through training improvements alone. Something fundamental had changed about enemy anti-aircraft systems, determining what required either captured equipment or detailed battlefield observation. The Americans maintained careful security protocols. No unexploded shells with new technology were recovered from land battles because the advanced ammunition wasn't being used over land. Only at sea, where enemy recovery was impossible, the secrecy remained absolute. Japanese pilots continued flying into increasingly lethal skies, confused and unprepared for weapons they couldn't understand. Neither side fully grasped they were witnessing a fundamental shift in Pacific warfare. The new proximity technology, deployed exclusively in anti-aircraft roles throughout 1943 and early 1944, was systematically destroying Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability. The Americans weren't merely shooting down more planes, they were changing the strategic mathematics of air-sea warfare. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on massed air attacks against American naval forces. This approach had succeeded at Pearl Harbor. It had worked in early carrier battles, but it required achieving concentration of force. Getting enough bombers and torpedo planes through defensive fire to inflict meaningful damage. The mathematics were simple, but brutal. If 50 attacking aircraft could expect to lose 10 planes to defensive fire, that was acceptable. 40 aircraft reaching their targets could sink a carrier or cripple a battleship. But if that same raid now lost 30 planes to defensive fire, the equation collapsed completely. 20 aircraft reaching their targets might damage ships, but probably couldn't sink them. And 60% casualties were strategically catastrophic. No air force could sustain such losses. Japanese commanders lacked the data to understand this shift. They observed increased casualties but attributed them to various factors. Better American pilots, more ships with more guns, improved training, bad luck. They didn't realize they were fighting a technological revolution. The commander of Japan's combined fleet reviewed casualty reports in his flagship's cabin. The numbers troubled him profoundly. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. By late 1943, fewer than 1,000 remained operational. Training replacement pilots required 18 months. Losing experienced aircrew at current rates meant that within a year, Japanese naval aviation would be manned primarily by inexperienced crews. And inexperienced crews had even lower survival rates against the new American weapons. Offensive operations had become unsustainable, but ceasing attacks would allow Americans to advance unopposed. Continuing operations at current loss rates would eliminate Japan's remaining air power entirely. The strategic situation had become impossible. Something had changed in American defensive capabilities. The exact nature remained unknown, but previous assumptions about acceptable casualty rates no longer applied. Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, the proximity technology remained one of the war's best-kept secrets. Japanese intelligence never captured an intact example. They never determined the exact operational mechanism. They knew American anti-aircraft fire had become dramatically more effective, but they couldn't explain the improvement. Some Japanese scientists theorized about radio proximity detonation. The concept wasn't unknown. German researchers had explored similar ideas before the war began. But theory and practical implementation were vastly different challenges. Creating miniature radio systems that could survive artillery launch, function reliably, and be mass-produced required solving dozens of engineering problems simultaneously. Even if Japanese scientists understood the basic principle, they lacked industrial capacity to implement it effectively. Japan's electronics industry was minuscule compared to America's. Vacuum tube production was extremely limited. Precision manufacturing at scale was impossible with available resources. Even capturing and reverse engineering a complete device perfectly wouldn't have enabled meaningful production numbers. This revealed the fundamental truth that neither side fully articulated during 1943. America wasn't winning solely through better tactics or superior resources. America was operating at a completely different level of technological sophistication. The proximity technology was just one example, but it represented a larger pattern. Superior radar systems, better fire control computers, advanced communications equipment, better everything, and crucially, all produced in vast quantities. By war's end, American factories had manufactured over 22 million proximity devices. Approximately 5 million were used in anti-aircraft roles in the Pacific Theater. The remainder went to other theaters or remained stockpiled. Japan, meanwhile, never produced anything comparable, not a working prototype, not a failed development attempt, not even a serious research program. The technological gap was absolute. After Japan's surrender, a Japanese commander sat in an interrogation room facing American technical intelligence officers. The war was over. Secrecy no longer mattered. The Americans were surprisingly forthcoming about their weapon systems, perhaps because Japan could no longer pose any threat. American officers noted that Japanese aircraft losses had increased dramatically in mid-1943. Had Japanese forces determined the cause? The commander shook his head. They had observed that American anti-aircraft fire became more effective. They had never understood how. The American officer produced a proximity device, placing it on the table between them. This was what had killed so many Japanese pilots. It contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. It detected proximity to aircraft and detonated automatically at optimal range. The Japanese officer picked up the device, examining it carefully. It appeared smaller than expected, unremarkable in appearance. How many had been produced? Over 22 million units. The number was incomprehensible. The Japanese commander set the device down carefully. His forces had never possessed a realistic chance against such technology. Not against an industrial system capable of mass-producing something this sophisticated. The American officer agreed quietly. Japan hadn't stood a chance. The war's outcome had been determined before fighting even began. Combat had simply been the process of proving this industrial and technological superiority. The Japanese commander thought about all the skilled pilots he had known, all the experienced aviators who had died in combat. They had fought courageously. They had executed their missions with professional competence. They had done everything their training and doctrine required, and they had been systematically slaughtered by weapons they never understood, produced in quantities they couldn't match, by an enemy whose industrial capacity they had fatally underestimated. When had Americans first deployed these weapons? Mid-1943, exclusively in anti-aircraft roles. The secret had been maintained for 2 years. Americans couldn't risk Japanese capture and examination of the technology. Once deployed in ground combat roles in December 1944, secrecy was compromised. But by then, the war's outcome was already certain. If Japanese leadership had known about and understood these weapons, would anything have changed? Probably not, the American officer concluded. Even with complete knowledge, Japan couldn't have built similar devices. Their electronics industry couldn't match American capabilities. Their manufacturing couldn't match American output. Understanding a weapon and countering it were entirely different challenges. The story of proximity technology in the Pacific is often overshadowed by more dramatic narratives. Island campaigns receive more attention. Carrier battles generate more interest. Atomic weapons capture more headlines. But in many ways, the proximity story is more significant. It represents something more fundamental than any single battle or weapon system. It demonstrates the industrial and technological gap that made Japan's defeat inevitable from the war's beginning. Japanese pilots in 1943 were flying into a new form of warfare. one where their skill and courage became irrelevant against systematic technological advantage. They couldn't train their way out of this disadvantage. They couldn't fight harder or develop superior tactics. The shells exploding around them represented industrial capacity and scientific sophistication they couldn't match. Every proximity device was a demonstration of American manufacturing capability. Every successful airburst proved the existence of research and development systems operating at levels Japan couldn't approach. And there were millions of them. Millions of small, unremarkable devices. Each one a miniature engineering marvel. Each one mass-produced with precision that Japanese industry couldn't replicate. The American gunnery officer watching impossible hit rates saw the future of naval combat. The Japanese pilot flying through increasingly lethal skies saw friends die with mechanical precision. Neither fully understood the scope of what they were witnessing. They were observing the future of warfare itself. A future where industrial capacity and technological sophistication determined outcomes more than courage or tactical brilliance. A future where the ability to mass-produce complex electronics became as important as the ability to field armies. Proximity technology didn't win the Pacific War single-handedly, but it eliminated thousands of Japanese aircrew. It forced Japan to abandon offensive air operations. It demonstrated industrial advantages so vast that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome them. Perhaps most significantly, it accomplished all this while remaining almost completely secret from the enemy. The Japanese lost the war fighting weapons they understood, but they were also dying to weapons whose very existence remained hidden from them. That invisibility, that complete asymmetry of knowledge and capability, was perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire conflict. When the war ended and these devices were finally revealed, Japanese officers responded with shock and resignation. Shock at the technological sophistication. Resignation because understanding the weapons made clear just how completely outmatched they had been. The mathematics were inescapable. America had produced 22 million units of weapons Japan couldn't have built even one of successfully. That production ratio told the entire story of the Pacific War more clearly than any battle analysis ever could. In the end, proximity technology stands as evidence of fundamental truths about modern warfare. Technology and industrial capacity matter more than individual courage. Production capability determines strategic outcomes more than tactical skill. Wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, laboratories, and research facilities. The Japanese pilots who died in 1943 never knew what killed them. They never understood they were fighting not just American sailors and pilots, but an entire industrial system operating at scales and sophistication levels their nation couldn't match. That ignorance was itself part of their defeat, a defeat written in the sky by shells that knew exactly when to explode, by weapons that turned courage into irrelevance and skill into statistics. The proximity revolution changed everything while revealing nothing to those it destroyed. It killed with precision while maintaining perfect secrecy. It ended careers while beginning a new age of technological warfare. And it did all this through the simple mechanism of making shells smart enough to know when they were close enough to kill. In the vast complexity of the Pacific War, sometimes the most profound changes came in the smallest packages. 22 million small packages, each one a death sentence wrapped in scientific achievement. Each one a demonstration that the future belonged to whoever could build the most sophisticated weapons in the greatest quantities. The Japanese never stood a chance. They just didn't know it until the shells started exploding at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, with exactly the right timing to turn their courage into casualty statistics.